Welcome to this video on subprograms. We're going to cover everything you need to know for GCSE. I've split the topic into 3 videos, so hopefully I can make each one kind of a more manageable length. I'm going to use pseudocode in all of the examples. So we use the Cambridge iGCSE board, but the pseudocode is pseudocode. So you should be able to transfer that to any other exam board, or you should be able to also perhaps write it out in your chosen programming language as well, but it should all make sense. It might be handy to have a notepad and pen, so you can there's a few questions that you can have a go answering, and you might have come across some new keywords that you might want to make a note for as well. So this first video we're going to look at what are subprograms, why do we use them, what are the 2 types of subprogram, and what are parameters and arguments. So let's have a look. Subprograms, why do we use them? So we'll use the example of a quiz app. So if we were going to write a quiz app, we could approach the problem as one whole problem and just write one long bit of code to actually create our quiz app. But if we think about it, our quiz app could be split up into separate smaller problems. So for example, with selecting a difficulty, displaying a timer, displaying a question, and you can probably think of some more, but we'll just use those 3 for now. So the idea is we can create these parts separately as subprograms. So instead of having our overall quiz app as we got down the bottom here, we can now look at it like this. So we're saying, well, the main part at this top level is our quiz app, but to solve that, we can actually split it up into these 3 parts. So now we've got select difficulty, display timer, and display question. So these are now our subprograms. And some of the reasons for doing that are things like we've got 3 smaller problems now. So each one of these is going to be individually easier to solve than one big problem. We can share the workload out. So if we've got 3 programmers, for example, we could give each programmer one of these to work on. So we can have a team of programmers working on each part, each subprogram, because the subprograms, you can test them and run them independently. All we do is we put them together to form the quiz app when they're all finished. And it's also going to be easier to find errors because if there was an error with the timer, we could just look in the display timer subprogram rather than looking through the whole code. And that's particularly useful if we've got a logic error that we need to find. They can be quite tricky. So subprograms break a large problem into smaller parts, smaller problems, which are easier to solve for some of the reasons that we've sort of talked about here. So following on from that, why use them? So if we've got some code we want to use quite often, we could just keep retyping it when we want to use it. So you can see I want to add numbers up, but I want to do it 4 times. So I'm changing the numbers, but I'm using this code here, these 2 lines of code. I'm repeating them. Answer assigned num1 plus num2, output answer, and then the answer variable. So I've done that 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. So have a think. If you want to pause the video and just have a little think, what are the disadvantages of long repeating code? Well, things like it's going to take longer to write out, first of all, because there's more lines of code. It's going to take longer to write because we're just repeating that code 4 times, whereas perhaps we only really need to write it out once. There's more chance of making a mistake, so every time you write a line of code, you're increasing the odds of having a typo, for example, or making a mistake. We all do it. Because the code is longer, our program's going to be a bit harder to understand as well. And even if you're a really good programmer, that doesn't mean maybe it won't be harder for you to understand, but it's going to take longer for you to understand it because you have to read all of that code. And potentially it might be a bit harder to spot or find errors, and particularly, as I mentioned before, finding a logic error, sometimes they can be quite difficult to find. So less lines of code, they're going to be a bit easier to spot. So let's have a little look at kind of introduce how subprograms work. So instead of writing out all that code we had on the last slide, we can just create a subprogram. And what we've done here is we've tried not to have lots of repeating code. So we've looked at this idea and we said, well, look, these 2 lines of code, they're repeating. So we're going to turn those into a subprogram. A subprogram is a named block of code. So there's the name, add, that will perform a task. And usually it's good practice for your subprogram just to do one thing. So we took the repeating code and we turned it into a subprogram. So we took all this code that repeats the same each time and we wrote it out once we gave it a name, and we've created a subprogram. Now this subprogram is called a procedure, and a little bit later in this video, this introduction video, we'll just look at the differences. Well, there are two types of subprogram you need to know about, and we'll just look at the differences between them. But we're using a procedure for now. And what happens is how they work. So subprogram, when we run our code, the subprogram is just loaded into RAM, and it sits in the RAM, in the memory of your computer, and it's just waiting for us to use it. So how do we use it? Well, we simply call it by using its name. So for example, we could write, so in this particular pseudocode I'm using here, we write the word call. That tells us we want to access a subprogram. Then we put the name of the subprogram, and in brackets we put the values that we want that subprogram to use. So in this case, I want to add 4 and 3. So 4 and 3 are passed to the subprogram. Num1 will become 4, num2 will become 3. We can then add them and output the answer. Later in this video, we'll see exactly how that works. So don't worry too much about that now. But just the idea, we simply can keep calling our subprogram. So we can now call it again and give it 2 new values, and it will add them. Call it again, give it 2 new values, we can add them. And we'll call it one more time, give it 2 new values, and we can add them. So instead of writing out all of this code to add up these sets of numbers, we simply write a subprogram, and then we call it, and we just give it the new numbers each time. So a little question, what is the name of the subprogram in the example that we're using? I think we've mentioned it a couple of times. It's add. Okay, so I've mentioned on the last slide there were 2 types of subprogram you need to know about: procedures and functions. So this would be, again, this is a key point. You may wish to make some notes here if you're doing some revision, but anyway, let's have a look. So the first one is a procedure. A procedure is a named block of code. So we saw that on the last slide, so we call that as add. A named block of code that runs when called. It performs a task, but it does not return a value to the rest of the program. So a procedure is a named block of code, like we saw. It'll do its job, but it doesn't return anything to the rest of the program. And there's the procedure we looked at on the last slide. It's called add. It does its task, doesn't return anything to the rest of the program. Whereas a function is pretty much exactly the same as a procedure. So it's a named block of code that runs when it's called, but the difference is a function will return a value to the rest of the program. And in the next video, we'll see how that works, or the video after it might be, but we'll see how that works. Right, so next keyword, we talked about parameters and arguments. So those are pretty important if you have to talk about how subprograms work. So parameters, subprograms use parameters, and these are placeholders written in the brackets when we define the subprogram. So this first line here is our definition. So it's a procedure, so we've stated that. It's called add, and then in brackets here, these are our parameters, and they're going to act as placeholders. So the first one, we've called it num1. We can call it whatever you want, but it makes sense to call it something that is meaningful. So num1 will be number 1, and that's a parameter. Num2 is going to be holding number 2 for me, and that's also a parameter. And like I said, these are going to act as placeholders for the values that we want the subprogram to use. So when we call the subprogram, we use arguments, and now these are actual values, and they're passed into those parameters. So we've got 3 and 4. These are what we call arguments. So these values are passed in order. So 3 will go to num1, 4 will go to num2. Once they've been passed, so they're in those placeholders, those parameters, the subprogram can simply use them just like it would use a normal variable then. And we call these arguments. Okay, so worth making some notes here if this is something new to you. So we have got 2 parameters, num1, num2. Parameters will act as placeholders for the arguments we're going to pass to them. They're waiting to receive values from the call down here. They're waiting to receive the arguments. And when we call the subprogram, the values in brackets are passed to the subprogram. So for example, call add 3, 4. So we can see 3 is being passed to num1, and then 4 is being passed to num2. So we've passed our arguments to the parameters. Our subprogram can now use num1 and num2 as you would use normal variables in any program. So what will be the output? Well, I'm pretty sure you've already figured that out. So we're just adding 3 and 4 here inside a subprogram, and then we're outputting answer 7. And the great thing is now we can just keep reusing this subprogram. We can just keep calling it and passing it new arguments as many times as we want. So for example, we can just change the arguments, call add 8 to 4. That will give us a different output, so answer 12. Okay, so we just got a couple of questions for you to try now. If you want to pause the video at this point, have a go at the questions and then press play and we'll talk through the answers. Okay, so how many parameters does the subprogram print info have? So here's our subprogram. So remember, we're looking in the definition and the parameters are inside our brackets here. So I can see first name, which is a string, surname, which is a string, and age, which is a string as well. So we've got 3 parameters. Okay, next question. What will be printed by the following call to the subprogram? So we've got 3 arguments here. Scooby is going to be passed to the parameter first name, do passed to the parameter surname, 56 to the parameter age. So full name is going to be first name concatenated with a space concatenated with surname. So the plus here, because we're putting strings together basically with the plus, so we're concatenating. So we will have Scooby, which is first name, then a space, and do, which is surname. Then we've got years, which is age plus space 56 years old. So age, we pass that 56, so 56 years old is output as well. Okay, so that's task 1. Task 2, so I've got 2 partially written subprograms here, and I've got 2 partially written calls. So all I want you to do is to add parameters to each of the definitions and then add arguments to each call. So we want to add the numbers 3, 4 and subtract numbers 8, 4. So pause the video and have a go, press play. We'll work through the answers. So for the first one, so we are, for the add subprogram, we're actually sending it 2 values. You can see inside the subprogram, we want to add 2 values. So I'm going to create 2 parameters and I'm just going to call them num1 and num2, and I'm going to set them up as integers. Remember to separate them with a comma. And the second subprogram also works with 2 values as well. So I can see them in the subprogram itself, and I can see the fact that for the sub one, I want to call the subprogram with 2 arguments here as well. So again, I'm going to use the same 2 names. Makes sense to call them something sensible. And then for the call, I want to add 3, 4. So I'm going to simply write call add 3, 4, and then I'm going to subtract 8, 4. So I'm going to call the subprogram with the values 8, 4. Okay, so that's the first video. So thank you for if you made it to the end and if it's any use, great. The next video, if you're playing through the playlist, will play shortly. If not, I'm sure you'll be able to find it. So thank you very much, and good luck.